I'm welcoming everyone to this event where we're going to have the great opportunity to hear Julie Klam speak and ask her questions about her new book. So Julie is my neighbor, and long before I knew that she had written for David Letterman and that she had a number of really successful nonfiction books to her name, I knew her as the woman upstairs with the dogs that hated my dog. And we would find ourselves in the elevator, and I have this little pug, and he's pretty mild mannered. And Julie had at the time these two Chihuahua Boston mixes, and they were a team, and they hated any dog that wasn't part of their team. So eventually, once we learned to talk over the loud, angry yapping, we became friends because we sort of had no choice because we had to, make nice because the dogs were not making nice at all. So, and slowly over time, getting to know Julie a little bit, I realized that like this woman that I was chatting with in the elevator was like a successful, well-known writer of really excellent nonfiction. And
or animal trainer.
right, exactly. And so, we've just become friends over time. We've been in this building. This is a classic Upper West Side building. We've been here now something like 25 years, and Julie's been here now 10, 8, something like that, a while.
Yeah.
And right. And so, sometime earlier this year, Julie said to me, I have this new book, would you, and she actually included Maud because Maud's been writing, would you and Maud want to see it? And I was like, sure, I'd love to see it. So she sent me the galley, and I basically read it in a day. Like I couldn't put it down. I thought it was so funny and moving and interesting, and it's a story that all of us who sort of are part of the Jewish diaspora who we all of us here came from somewhere else, and which means that we all have these stories, these weird family stories. So Julie wrote a book, one of your first books, right? I think was about her dad's side of the family. Yes, your mom's side. Sorry. And so, and when she wrote that, she thought, "Oh, I'm interested in this genealogy stuff, and I want to write about the other side." But then, sort of life and other books got in the way. But a few years ago, she was like, "I'm going back to this." So, do you want to tell us a little bit, Julie, about this part of your family, why they fascinated you, and sort of how you got started on this quest with them?
Sure. So the first book was about my mother, my relationship with my mother and my mother's side of the family, which was a much more sort of traditional 1950s. They were in Riverdale in the Bronx. There were 4 daughters, and my mother's and her sister's responsibility was to get a good marriage. And the fact that like my mother got into Hunter High School, my grandparents didn't let her go there because at the time it was all girls. So
she wasn't going to meet anybody there.
Exactly.
Right.
So the point of an amazing high school. And somehow that was the identity I sort of related the most to. And then I sort of, when I was finishing, and I wrote that book because I had to sort of overcome that experience in my family growing up. My mom, I couldn't do that. I couldn't like aim for marrying somebody, but my mother wasn't really sure what to do. And one of the things that I was very interested in was a story that my grandmother and my cousin always told me about these 4 sisters in our family, these cousins of my grandmother's, who were 4 women who did everything on their own. They never had any men in their life and ended, being, chain smoking millionaires in New York City and Southampton. So, so I had started to do that book. I started to get the research on that book, and then I couldn't do it because of just what you said before. And so I came back to it in 2016 and we have like this whole amazing world of digitized information. And also my 2-year-old was 16, so I
Right.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was divorced and remarried, and
Things were easier.
things were a lot easier. So that's how it came about.
And then, so you started digging into this story, right? And you have these remarkable characters, and you're starting to talk to your family, and everyone has these stories about them. And then you start to sort of search for the truth, and you pretty quickly realize that you've been fed nonsense. Like you can't get to the bottom
Right.
of what the reality was. Like, were they millionaires? Where did they live? Did they get married? Where did they come from? How did they end up in New York? So can you talk a little bit about, digging in and like sort of where you started? And
so when I started to do this, it was not about uncovering the truth. It was about, I wanted
right.
a story of what happened with them because it was fascinating. There was one sister who was a playwright, and she thought somebody, a producer, the story was a producer stole her play and, put it on TV. And that was a big thing. They all had very interesting stories, one being that the financial one was a mistress of J.P. Morgan, and then
Right.
the first woman with a seat on the stock exchange, which all not true. And so anyway, I mean, it just was so interesting. And I'm a memoirist, and I've written a bunch of books, and I really wanted to dive in, and I could go to these places and start looking. And only when I was starting to like assemble the book did I realize that the things I'd heard were impossible. And then
Right.
it started to be more about the mythology, the myths our families pass down, and how we interpret that in our identity, and why they're told, and what is so interesting. And I'm a memoirist, and I've written a bunch of books, and I really wanted to dive in, and I go to these places and start looking.
Paula, I think you need to turn off your mic. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Um, so you this, you started here in New York, and you started by talking to family, but then you had to do some traveling.
Right.
So the first place you ended up was in the good old Midwest, where I never think of Jews anyway. Like, what would they be doing there? Why aren't they either in Los Angeles or New York? So can you talk about going there? And
there are Jews everywhere.
There are Jews everywhere. Right?
I don't want to like blow your. So what happened was, I mean, the story that I had heard was they came from Romania in the turn of the century. They went to Southampton, England, came to Ellis Island, and then on their way out to Los Angeles, because the father was a photographer and wanted to be a filmmaker, the mother went into labor in St. Louis and died in childbirth. And
maybe not the best time to travel.
But that was actually not true. They were going to St. Louis, and so the children went into an orphanage in St. Louis. So I went to St. Louis to sort of get a sense of the whole thing, and also try to figure out what happened to their mom. And I met up with this amazing genealogist in St. Louis, who sort of taught me how to do the searches that I was completely incapable of.
Right.
So, Midwest, everybody's much nicer. It was a lot easier to have these problems there.
Right. Well, I mean, that's, that part of the book is, I don't want to say disturbing. It's just very upsetting. It's like most of us don't think about those times and the sort of the poverty and the fact that, I mean, we know it. We know that child rearing was like the woman's domain. So what happens if the woman is somehow incapacitated? And but not in such a way that the husband can immediately remarry someone to start looking after the children. So you discovered that these girls spent many years in an orphanage, although their parents were alive,
Right.
which is really upsetting.
Yeah. Well, so at that point, between the about 1900 and 1935, there were a lot of children in orphanages that were either half orphans, which meant they had one parent alive, or both their parents were living and they couldn't take care of them. Or sometimes they would drop them off there like Monday morning and pick them up on Friday night. So my relatives were considered half orphans because supposedly their mother was dead and their father was alive, but their mother was actually alive. So, and that was the thing. Um, and,
Do you, you know, it's, I mean, we all live, it's so interesting, right? We all now live in this post-Freudian world. And, we're New Yorkers, so everyone's in therapy. And half our congregation is therapists, I think. So when discovered that the mom had basically, she'd been committed with this bipolar disorder, which they didn't even really know how to name at the time, right? It's like hysteria or whatever. And she was there for a very long time. She lived out her life there.
mm-hmm.
Did you feel like there was like this was trickle down information for you about your family now? I mean, I remember like myself, very late in my life, like I don't know, maybe I was in my 30s, when some family member said to me, "Oh, your grandmother, she used to go into these depressions where she would just sit in the porch in a rocking chair for months at a time." And I was like, really? That's only a generation back? Like, it's like illuminating, right? When you hear these things, as opposed to the wonderful mythologized stories.
Right. Well, I think one thing is that these, you know, teenage, early 20s girls coming to New York didn't really want the world to know. I mean, they were not wanted in Romania, and
Right.
they were not wanted. They felt
Right.
they were wanted at home. That they sort of dying in childbirth would be a much preferable description of what happened to
Right.
you and where you ended. My mother died in childbirth, and I managed to get out here.
Right.
Um, you know, it was that was there was a lot of shame in a lot of areas, and that
Right.
was yeah,
And a lot of self-preservation,
right.
right? I mean, and they did have this enormous gumption, the Morris sisters. I mean, they got out of the orphanages and they got each other out, right? Like
Yeah,
they,
yeah,
so
I mean, yeah, and they really wanted to uh, get away from that. They moved to New York City and lived in the West Village,
West Village.
in
Mhm.
this very artsy area, and they were reinventing themselves like everybody was. It
Right.
was not a great thing to be an immigrant. So, and all but one of the Moore sisters were born in Romania. So,
Right.
yeah.
And so at one point in the story, you decide that um, you know, it's important to go back to Romania, which
Mhm.
is a wonderful part of the book because it's both like a little bit of comedy of errors and also incredibly moving, to see these remnants of your family and remnants of Judaism and, of Jewish life from
Yeah.
that's just doesn't really even exist. So can you just tell us a little bit about your trip and
I
your,
mean,
your great guide and,
we went. I wanted to go back to the town that my family was from, and um, it's not that easy to connect with people there. So I kept emailing the guy who ran the Jewish community in this town, Focșani, Romania, and he didn't ever get back to me. And at one point, I was like, I'm going to just have to go and chance it. And so my then boyfriend and I went to Romania, and we did have a guide because it wasn't like we could go around Romania and speak for ourselves. So he was uh, so he took us there and spoke for us. And this was in 2016. Um, 2016. And brought us to this Jewish community in Fukshani. And we met with, came there and a woman opened the door and she said, the rabbi is not here. The rabbi, her husband, and he's not really a rabbi. He runs the community.
Right.
He's not here. He'll be back tomorrow. So we, stayed in our like $30 a night hotel and, went and completely shook up a restaurant by going into it. And
after hours, right?
Yeah, And during the week, it was like everybody there was like, I think it must have made the papers. And then we came back the next day and he was there and he said he came to the synagogue in the 1970s. And he said, communism had come in before that. So the communists had gotten rid of all of the Jewish stuff. First, the Holocaust was there and then communism.
Right.
And he walked into the temple and went into the bathroom and found this huge stack of books that they had hidden behind the toilet of all of this information about the Jews in the town.
It's incredible, really.
Yeah. So he looked at these books. That was mind blowing. And then we went to another town that had the cemetery in it. The whole thing was just extraordinary. And really, more than anything, I did an event with a genealogist, and she was saying that she felt like trips back to your Eastern European towns where everybody was taken away get you much more in touch with the Jewish experience than going to Israel. I don't think there should be one or the other.
Right.
Definitely, I knew what she was talking about because you're here. We were here where these people were like completely forgotten.
Right.
I went to the cemetery and there were it was the town also had earthquakes, but the cemetery was just like in rubble. And, it just felt like everyone there had been forgotten. And that was so moving to me. That I think brought me in touch with my whole family life experience more than anything else.
Right. I'm about to, I think, sneeze.
Oh, everyone.
I'm trying to, contain myself. Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. But it is this funny thing about being, Jewish, right? Which is most of the time when we were leaving places, we were leaving under duress, right? It wasn't like, I think I'll just set out and make a new life for myself. It was like, I got to get out of here. And I'll never forget, I had a friend for a little while who had actually converted to Judaism, but her family was Scottish. And one day we were at her apartment and she brought out this book. It was a very odd looking book. It was very long, it opened from the top and it was this long object. And I said, what's that? And she said, oh, it's the pedigree. And I said, like dogs, like the thing I know? And she's like, no, like my family. And it literally had like who was on the Mayflower, right? And we just don't have that because we're always running and we can't carry a lot with us. And then when we get where we're going, we want to forget how terrible it was.
Right.
So much of this information, it's incredible to me that you were able to dig all this up and that sort of, this is the beauty of your writing and also of being a memoirist is that you could when you hit a brick wall, it was a poetic brick wall, right? It's like I sort of was looking for these answers, but I couldn't get those answers. Yeah. So what answers did I get? And that's, the brilliance of the book.
I think that something that all genealogists, and I don't account myself as one of them because I do it very badly. But they, the brick wall is being not figuring out the crossword puzzle right away. So so that is like fascinating to them. To me, as not a genealogist, I wanted the answers right now.
Right.
I went to the New York Public Library genealogy room kind of late in the game because they had been in New York and I wanted to sort of get New York information. And I spent, 2 days there, and the only thing that I successfully found was the bathroom. So I was just sort of like, not. I couldn't, and it's hard. It's hard to do, but their lives were not like our lives. I mean, I was interviewed by somebody recently, and she said, like, what do you think people will find, what could find about, your great grand niece could find about you in the future? And I said, everything. They'll see when I was looking at a J. Crew sale, and, when I was shopping for groceries, it's like, we are completely out there, and they're not. So,
right. I wonder, there's so many things about this book. You got photographs from family, I assume, right? A lot were, and your family cooperated. I mean, I think some of them must have been sad to learn that the legends that they had been carrying were not, it wasn't the truth, but they still were more than willing to help you and give you material.
Yeah, I mean, I think that everybody, they were removed enough that my generation and the one right above me were, younger and, removed enough from them that they were okay with whatever was uncovered.
Right.
And actually interested to find out whatever I could find out, because it affects all of us. Everybody was, told their part of the story, and then was interested to find out when I would say, well, actually, that wasn't what happened. Your mother told you that, but that wasn't the story. And they were, it's like, I think we like finding those things out. I mean, I guess if you're, royalty, you don't want to, find out you're not. But none of us have like that much stake or, in what happened. And I think so many of us just don't know. And
but it's so interesting because I think people have a very personal and kind of psychological reaction to this kind of information. And I think one of the reasons your book moved me is that, like, I had a mother who, like, didn't care about any of this, right? So when I was turning 30, I said to her, if I don't get my baby book for my 30th birthday, I'm not speaking to you again. Like, you've had 30 years to pull it together. And she actually did. She, like, somehow dug it out, entered what the top song was in 1962, because you're right. Like, now that information is right out there, but someone had to, if you wanted to keep that information, someone had to be doing the work at the time. And so, of course, my reaction to that is that my daughter's life is like, if she ever gets famous, they can just come to my house for the museum. Like, when her first word, what day she said it, everything is there. When she saw her first movie, what it was. So it's really interesting to look at the past like this when it wasn't there, and you're,
when I was in Romania, I had before I went a Romanian genealogist go to the town to look up the birth records, because they're handwritten, in 1890 something, and you have to like go through these files to find them.
Right.
So he went and did that and translated them for me. And one of the things when I went to the town, I had showed these translations to the Jewish community leader, and I said, it said here that she was born in 1894, and he said, yeah, but the guy who wrote it was 74 years old. So, and 74 in the 18,
whereas like 107, right?
Yeah. So he was like, you can't believe that, and so there was a lot of information that was written down and passed down incorrect. And if you do any sort of genealogy on Ancestry, you look up a relative and you can find 5 different birth dates, and they're all the same person.
Yes.
And 5
Yes.
different last names, spellings, and a complete mishmash of conflicting information that you have to sort of sift through. So, yeah.
I'm curious. I'm not so good at this, and I don't know if everybody else is either, but I'm just curious out of everyone who's attending, how many people are doing, like, we're already doing sort of some genealogical research. Like, can we like show hands or whatever? Like, there's some way to raise your hand on here, right?
Yeah, there is.
Right. Do people know how to raise their hand? Or even turn on your camera and like raise your hand.
You
And then
can use
I'm
the hand raise function in the
Yeah, they
participants
did.
panel.
right. Yeah, so here they are. So people are, and then I'm curious, like, if you like,
Reactions.
did this accelerate because of the pandemic? Because I feel like everybody was stuck at home. That's why I think this book is extremely timely. We were all at home, and not once but twice during the pandemic, I had someone reach out to me and say, we're related. Our great grandfathers were brothers. And I actually, because of that, got information I hadn't had before. So, I mean, I think this is relevant to,
and the DNA things. People are also reaching out to various people, and that opens up a whole bunch of stuff. I didn't know this about you. Here I can tell you this about me.
right. It's very interesting to me. I mean, I'm just curious now that the book is out. I mean, I know that it's like just out. Are you getting contacted by people who are saying anything to you like, I think we're related by this person?
Not yet. But I've gotten a ton of people. I mean, one of the unfortunate things about having a book come out in the pandemic is you're not actually speaking to people, and
Right.
They're not usually even on the Zoom screen like this. It's usually I just know they're out there in the void.
Right.
And, when you write a book, you go to places and talk to people, and they ask, and they tell you stories. But I've gotten a few emails from people who just are saying, I always thought that my uncle was at Custer's Last Stand. We all thought that, and it gave me so much pride. And then I started looking, and there was like no way it could have happened.
Right.
And I sort of think about that with
well, that's what happened with JP Morgan, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was just not JP Morgan. It was somebody else. And
right.
But I think all of us, especially, when you're kids and you're listening to your parents, you're not thinking like, I'm going to double check and make sure that that's true. You're just like, oh, we're royalty. We're,
right.
My mother said we were related to Irving Berlin, and I was just like, that's it. I told everybody we were related to Irving Berlin. And later it turned out that she was thinking of somebody else. But then she said, we're related to the woman who owned Hart's Mountain, the flea tick company. And I was like, okay, well,
See, that explains your dog connection, though. I mean,
well, she heard it, she transposed it, a lot of those kinds of things. And other people definitely have those stories. I often think that about, Elizabeth Warren talking about being Native American. Like, you sit there and your parents are saying we're Native American or Cherokee or whatever. And you're like, okay, so we are. And then you tell your friends and everybody's like, oh, that's interesting.
Right. And, that is the flip side, actually. Like you're saying, in another generation or two, people will be able to look back and know that you were shopping at J. Crew, right? But the same time is everything's disproven. Like, I wonder if we're going to lose some of this lovely, like, whisper down the lane nuance, right? Because now it's out there. It's right there in front of your face. Jack at work just had to proof someone's like a obituary tribute, and it's all like everybody thought he had done X, Y, and Z, and it turns out that he did X, but he didn't do Y and Z, and now you can find that out, right? So it's we're like losing a little poetry, right?
If you want to
Marilyn, that's very funny. Marilyn has said only if someone saves the J. Crew records.
I have no doubt. There's like a big central computer of retail.
Right.
I mean, you think about when you're telling your child about people in your family that you love, you tell them, great things and maybe make them a little bit more palatable or interesting or whatever. And I think that's the thing. And, definitely family stories are like a game of telephone,
Right. They totally are. They totally are.
you know,
So,
that's what happened with the JP Morgan thing. It was Harold Bache that she was thinking of, but she didn't know who Bache, Prudential Bache, she didn't know who that
right.
was. JP Morgan was the person. That's how. So
Right.